everybody, I'm Jen,
And I'm Tammy.
and they call us Woo.
Welcome back, everybody. Today we are talking about just a discussion around an interesting post I found, excuse me, when I was scrolling the interwebs that got me thinking. So somebody posted about in this kind of spiritual forum um, about having what they felt like was a spiritual awakening, and they're 25, and they said something about what is everybody's thoughts on it because someone had told them that they can't have a spiritual awakening until their age of 40. And so I was like, oh, that's really interesting. So I read the comments because I had never heard that before. So I read the comments, and there was, of course, quite a few people are like, age doesn't matter. There's no reason to believe that you can't have an awakening, at any point in your life. And kind of when we were talking about this a little bit on the side too, I mean, I suppose people's definitions of spiritual awakening are all very different too. But
Hmm.
then there was some interesting ones where people were talking about very specific ages. One person was talking about having 7 chakras in 7 years to develop the chakra, starting at the root, and basically just saying by the 42nd, which would be your third eye, and the 49th, which would be your crown, you'll have attained more wisdom. So they're like, I don't know if someone is referring to that, which I thought was interesting because that's definitely not where my head went. And then there was another one. Oh
Oh, I'm
gosh.
kind of excited. I'm in my 42nd year. So that means that I have 7 more years and I'll be
You'll know
like walking on
everything.
water and like doing all the things.
There you go. That's your walking on water year. Um they have one of those like silver anniversaries and stuff like that. That's your walking on water anniversary.
Yes. 49. That's what I'm looking forward to.
um and then there
Please
was
don't
this
shove me
other.
in the water that day.
I'll warn you first.
Okay.
um there was another one that I thought was kind of interesting too, where it was talking, someone specifically said it happens when you reach 50. There wasn't like a question mark. It was just like, nope, it happens when you're 50. I was 52 when it happened. And then of course other people are like, this doesn't make fully any sense. And then I mean, most of them were like very good, I guess, like rallying around like, hey, this is your experience, you can kind of have it whatever whenever. But then there was also kind of the weird ones too, where some people are like, or maybe it's time to consider how awake you really are because you think it's a one and done kind of thing. So like there was a lot of opinions about this, which I
Yeah.
also think is kind of fascinating, how sometimes people can really kind of get in their heads about how
Hmm.
this is all quote unquote supposed to work. And it just brought
Yeah.
a lot of thoughts to my head. So I know we had already started kind of talking about that ahead of time.
Yeah.
And we had some interesting things come up. But what have you heard about there being any particular age or anything like that where awakening
So I've
happened?
actually had a lot of conversations in the past that weren't specifically around this topic, but people ended up talking about age and talking about one when I was younger. Um, I knew a lot of things, and sometimes people would ask me questions about awakening and the ascension process and whatever words people were labeling it with. And I was like, oh, I don't know. I'm where I'm at. I don't know. And I actually had a lot of people who had family members or friends who lived in India. And in those conversations, it was interesting because there were some specific ages. Like there was more of a question of, well, if you're young, you can't be at that level. You don't have enough knowledge yet.
Mm-hmm.
And so I always thought maybe it was just a cultural belief where it was like, oh, in certain cultures, like this is what their belief system is you have to go through a certain set of processes before you get to a phase where you're open enough and you have enough knowledge or you have experienced enough to let things in.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know if that's like a Hindu tradition. I don't know if that's like, I don't know where that stems from, or if it's just their families and their friends.
Mm-hmm.
Like we were all in the same circle, so it might have been people who knew each other. I don't know. But when you brought up that post, I was like, oh, okay, maybe this is a tradition thing. But then it also brought up like there's a difference between Kundalini awakening,
Mm-hmm.
which would be more of a cultural, religious, or belief based process,
Mm-hmm.
or just a spiritual awakening, which are two different things. So it might be that people are trying to have a conversation about this and they're coming at it from two different places, like
Sure.
spiritual awakening versus Kundalini awakening, or spiritual awakening versus
Mm-hmm.
whatever else is in their head.
Yeah, and the
So,
funny thing is, what it brought up for me was mostly I, like how many shoulds we put on ourselves sometimes.
stop shooting all over yourself.
Exactly, because as I was kind of reading through it, I was like, that's interesting to get all of these perspectives, but also we are the ones who truly know where we're at on our path, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
sometimes it's easier to put these like rules around things because we feel like in our human minds it makes more sense if there's
Mm-hmm.
some type of rule, and if I do it this way I'm going to get this result. And it's just so
Mm-hmm.
much more like broad and expansive than that.
Yeah.
And it's like it's hard sometimes for us to wrap our brains around the fact that like there is no wrong way to do this. There is
Yeah.
no wrong behavior. There is no like that's just not the way this works. Like we're doing everything exactly as we should, and we have the free will to make up our minds about how all of this is
Mm-hmm.
going to look. But I think I've noticed it a lot, and maybe it's just because there's more access to information and social media and stuff. But I've noticed as more people are talking about it openly about spirituality and stuff like that, it's like I see a lot more of this, either people searching for, I want the way to do this, or people giving a lot of opinions on this is the way to do it, which is interesting to me because, again, like I just said, that in and of itself isn't wrong. It's just a way
Yeah.
that people are trying to make sense of things in their minds. But um, it is kind of funny when I come across stuff like that and I'm like, wow, that is such a really specific way to look at things. And I just didn't realize that sometimes people have such a specific way. And it's really not outside of a lot of forms of spirituality that do have, kind of traditions and stuff. But
Mm-hmm.
it's just kind of fascinating to me that that is what we search for sometimes is,
Yeah.
okay, well, I need to be this thing in order for this to happen.
Yeah.
And I don't know, in my personal experience, like none of the things that have happened that have been epic in my life have been anything that I would have thought rolled out the way that it did.
Yeah.
It was
Yeah.
all stuff that, like, in hindsight, larger picture, all of a sudden made sense. But I couldn't have known that ahead of time. Otherwise, it wouldn't have worked out the way that it did. Like, it happened
Yeah.
exactly how it should have in the broader picture. Well, I was off, like, looking at something else. And then
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, oh, wow, there's a whole big picture back here I didn't see.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So this brought up like so many different things. So the first thing is around like the rules and the structure and how people will set things in place and they're like, okay, I have to hit this mile marker. I have to hit this mile marker. I have to do this. Sometimes as human beings, we do that so that it's not attainable. Like,
Mm,
and
that's a good
sometimes
point.
our ego gets super in the way
Right.
and is like, okay, I'm going to set this bar right here. And by the time you're 27 and three quarters, you have to do these things. By the time you're 49, you have to walk on water or you didn't make the cut. And I think that sometimes our human nature gets in the way and creates these structures to keep us stuck. Because then, if we don't attain that by that certain age, it's like, oh, well, I just did it wrong. So
Yeah.
like
But
then
it's
you can give up and
interesting
move on.
that we can like do that to ourselves where we
Mm-hmm.
can tell ourselves we are doing our own lives and our own like souls and our own like we're doing it wrong. Like there's a way
Yep.
to do any of this like wrong, and if like you said, if I don't get the thing, then
Mm-hmm.
I did something wrong, or someone else did something, that happens too, or it's like I couldn't get my thing because someone else was in my way.
Mm-hmm.
It's really interesting. But then when you look at the larger picture of that too, sometimes that is also for a reason, right? Sometimes there's
Mm-hmm.
other things that are at play that need to
Yeah.
finish before we're able to move on to that next thing. It's fascinating to think about it
Mm-hmm.
that way. But
Yeah.
I love that we don't need to have the limitations. It's just really interesting to like piece together the ways that we sometimes do that, because certainly like if I came across that, there is a message in there for me too, right? Where I'm, that's just the way it works. There's usually a message in it for us too. We're like, oh, okay, what parts
Yeah.
of my life am I telling myself you have to
Mm-hmm.
do this thing for this thing to happen? And if it doesn't happen, you're doing it wrong.
Yeah. Well, and I think in that post that you sent me, there was somebody in there who seemed like they were a little bit defensive about it and like you're thinking about this all wrong and you need to reassess. Um and maybe they weren't like that. Maybe I just read it like that because I was like, "Ooh, they're
There was
judging."
a post in
Um
there where they're like, you're thinking about, or you're, how awake are you really, basically, if you're thinking that you only need to do this once, is kind of
well,
the
and
gist of it.
so that specific post talked about think about when you go to sleep. Like think about the sleep wake cycle. And it was really interesting to me because it I that actually did make me think about how we don't just go to sleep and wake up once. It's like it is a cycle. It's
Mm,
like we go through these processes like learning and growing, sleeping and waking, where it's like you gain so much from the first step of that cycle and you come to a point where you feel as though you're awake and then you need to take a rest period again
mm,
so that
mm-hmm.
you can step into the next level of your learning, your processing, your
That's an
growing, your
interesting way to
healing,
look at it.
whatever.
Yeah.
And so that post, like the you need to assess your, I was like, that's an interesting thing to think about is like nothing that's happened before is necessarily wrong or right.
Mm-hmm.
It was just that part of that sleep awake cycle.
Mm-hmm.
And now we're in this new part of the cycle where we're looking at things and sleeping and waking and sleeping and waking.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was a kind of cool way to look at it. So thank you for being indignant about the whoever you are. I don't know who that was, but thank you for bringing that up because it really did make me think about it.
Yeah, that is a
And
good way to look at it. I mean,
yeah,
like flipping it around a little bit to like, oh, that is actually, I mean, indignant piece aside, that's like, you know, it is true. I was just
mhm,
talking to someone today too who was asking my perspective on, um, this whole spiritual awakening, or the word awaken, or, being fully awake, or whatever that gets talked about a lot. And she was just asking my perspective. She's like, well, do you think that means that we have been asleep up until this point? Um, like we're waking up to the matrix or whatever. And I was like, well, there's a lot to unpack there, but basically we all, in my understanding of things, my current understanding of things, we're never actually asleep. We're just going through different experiences. It's
mhm,
like we have either agreed with others before we came into this life or whatever. Like we're constantly playing out all of these experiences. I mean, we have forever to do whatever the heck we want, so we're constantly
mhm,
playing stuff out. But until you get to this next point where you've kind of moved through whatever phase that you wanted to move through when you felt like you were quote unquote asleep, you don't always understand because you can't understand at the time because you want to finish your experience. So,
Yeah.
like, it's not necessarily a sleep, it's just you're finishing an experience and then moving on to your next phase of that experience or another experience. And it's all just like this wonderful little web of experiences we're having. And
Yeah.
she was like, "Oh, yeah, that makes a lot of sense." Because I said, I guess my understanding of everything coming from love and light and everything being about just having all of these experiences and all of this beautiful, growth and the things that we get to do in all of these lifetimes is there's never a time when you're doing it wrong. It's just
Hmm.
a part of what you have decided you want to do. Because ultimately, we have decided that we wanted to do this. So I
Yeah.
think sometimes using like sleep, awake, like I exited the matrix, there might be some layers to that have some truth to it. But it sounds so harsh when that really is
Yeah.
like, that's like saying that you were doing something wrong before and now you figured
Mhm.
it out and you're doing it right.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't necessarily think that that's the way at least in my
Yeah.
understanding, that
Yeah.
works as far as like being so harsh on ourselves with that.
Yeah.
Where I like what you were describing more of like the gentle cycle of
Hmm.
rest and awareness and rest and awareness. Because, like, well, yeah, that makes a lot of sense because that's kind of the way everything works. We have the rest
Yeah.
period where we're like processing stuff, and then we have this period of like movement and creation and growth, and then we have rest. I like the way that you phrased that.
Yeah. Well, and so a few weeks ago, I was working with a client and the whole awake term came up and it kept coming up with this person in particular. And it was like, when am I gonna awaken? When am I gonna? And there was this whole, actually, this has come up in several sessions lately. And one of my guides came in and was talking about how that term is a term of separation. It is
Maybe that's
creating a
why it feels
separation in the whole.
like a
And
rub.
it's like, yeah. And it's not that you're awake or you're not,
Mm-hmm.
it's that you're moving through the cycle. And when you were talking, it made a little bit more sense to me. Like I understood what he was saying when he was talking to me about this, that it is creating separation. It's saying, oh, I'm awake and you're asleep, and
Mm-hmm. Or
or
even separation
vice
within
versa.
yourself, right? Like
Yes.
my
Yes.
past, I was so asleep, I didn't know shit.
Yes.
And now I'm
Yeah.
just like this whole
But
other
you just
thing.
knew, yeah, but you just knew something different.
Yeah.
And while you were talking, and when I brought up the whole sleep cycle thing, it's like, think about your sleep cycle itself. When you are asleep, like when you're laying in bed sleeping, there's different phases of your sleep.
Mm-hmm.
It's like you're aware of more things at different cycles.
Mm-hmm.
And then in certain parts of your sleep, you have this complete illusionary world, your dream state, which is kind of what we're living in right now. It's like we've created all of these human experiences to show us something, to bring something to the forefront, just like in our dream state.
Mm-hmm.
We're having all of these dreams to try to bring forward our subconscious thoughts or connect on a different level so that we do learn and grow more. It's all part of the same experience, it's all part of the same cycle. It's
Mm-hmm.
just, it's not that you're awake or asleep, it's that you're experiencing different pieces of that
Yeah.
whole process.
I like the way that sound, and that when you said shared what your guide said, I'm like, yes, that makes total sense why that phrase feels a little like uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
Um because it does feel like separation, which is I, there's no way to separate all of us. Like you
Yeah.
can try, but like physically, spiritually, energetically, and maybe that's just something that you're processing
Mm-hmm.
because again, it's all part of the whole thing. But as you were talking about that last thing, I was thinking of lately I like to keep putting into context for myself judgments by comparing it to like a baby, right? Like I've had
Hmm.
several people who have talked to me about like, oh man, I wish I got this thing that you got when you got all this I don't know, connection, when your connection
Hmm.
became more clear. And I was like, it's not really like that though. Like we all
Yeah.
have like there's no comparison and there's no
Uh-huh.
reason to compare. I'm not extra special because of this. I just happen to have this experience because I asked for it at this time,
Hmm.
and that's the way it worked. But we all have the capability. We all have really amazing special things about us. And I told one person, I'm like, judging yourself or comparing yourself is like getting mad at your finger for not being a toe, or
Yeah.
getting mad at a baby for being young, right? Like we get this idea like, oh, these like all this stuff happens for people who have, are these old souls, whatever. Yeah, there are old souls and young souls, but there is absolutely no reason to compare the two. There's not one that's better
Nope.
or not. So
Nope.
I keep comparing to like babies, right? And when you're talking about the sleep and awake, it's like, yeah, we don't ever like get mad at a baby for sleeping and being like, you're not awake. Like, you don't know what you're doing. You are
Sometimes we
not
get away, we
awake.
get mad when they're awake. Ah, stop.
But like all these things we apply to ourselves, and I know that's like in
Hmm.
physical context, but even like
Yeah.
them not understanding things, we're not just like,
Yep.
how dare you not understand how to
Yeah.
talk yet? They're babies, you know?
Yep.
And somehow we like don't apply that same thing to ourselves or the
Yep.
people around us. Sometimes we forget that like you said, it's just part of a cycle, and a beautiful cycle at that. I know
Hmm.
we've had conversations recently about even like the full cycle, which also involves release and like, I don't know, just embracing the whole thing. Like all of it
Yeah.
works together. But
Hmm.
yeah, I mean, if 40 was the age, I guess I missed my mark too, because, it happened a little later for me.
Well, yeah. I don't know.
But the
I
truth
don't believe
is
that age
like,
is a thing.
no. And the truth for me too is like when I look at it from the perspective that I look at stuff from now, it was like I keep saying like I'm just doing things with more clarity. Like I just understand what I'm doing more now, but I've always been searching for it. I've always been doing it to some extent. I just know what I'm doing a little bit more now. Like I can recognize it, I guess is the
Yeah.
word. And
Yeah.
so that's even not like what I'd call an awakening per se, in the sense of like I was one thing and now all of a sudden I'm another. It's just I decided that I wanted to kick the door down at one point, and
Yeah.
it's come with its own like unique experiences and challenges and wonderful things, and it's all part of the process.
Yeah.
But also I
I
can
just,
identify how many times I've already been on that path, this whole
hmm,
time.
yeah. Yeah. I had this vision of like sometimes when I am traveling out of body while I am asleep in bed, I will come back into my body too quickly and I wake up like this, like super jarring and like fully back into my body, just really, really quickly. And I was thinking about that. I'm like, sometimes when we start allowing ourselves to experience things, that's what it feels like. It's like this startling, very unexpected. All of a sudden, we're like, oh crap! Now I understand all this stuff.
Yeah.
And it's like you hear people, they're like, I just want to ascend. I just want to be awake. And it's like, do you really want that experience? Like you keep wishing for that and you're going to get that startled, like just really awake really quick, and then you have to deal with what that looks like in the rest of the world, because then you are experiencing how other people are still experiencing the world
Hmm.
as opposed to how you're experiencing the world.
Right.
And that transition can be rocky as well.
It can.
It can be startling.
It can. Yeah, I think startling is a good word for it. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I know we've both had experiences like that where
Hmm.
sometimes the major shift in perspective changes relationships, it changes a
Yep.
lot of things. And it doesn't mean that I would take back any of the things that have happened, but also being in a place where you're trying not to judge yourself and just have the experience that you're going to have
Yeah.
helps. But that's where I think this, like why sometimes people putting like really specific rules around stuff just strikes me as odd. But like you said, from other perspective, they're it's part of their experience too, and there is perhaps
Yeah.
things like about that are actually helping them,
Hmm.
process things in a different way.
Yeah. Well, and I know that sometimes I will create processes for myself, like very specific things that I do on a regular basis that sometimes I let fall off of my schedule and then they come back in eventually.
That's
But
like with
like,
everything that we don't
yes.
complete, right?
Yes, but sometimes I'm a very structured person. I know I might not sound like a very structured person, but sometimes I'm very, very structured and I will make myself schedules that are like down to the minute. My work schedule, people used to laugh. It was like at 7:02 in the morning, I'm leaving to go to my client's house. At
Wow.
7:32, I'm arriving at their house. Like I used to make schedules like that. I don't do that quite as much anymore unless there's something going on. But I used to put on those like making sure that I was smudging myself, making sure that I was taking regular detox baths, making sure like those things were part of my schedule. They were part of my routine because I felt like that was the only way that I was going to accomplish the goals and allow myself to experience everything that was coming in spiritually for me and keeping myself open. And it wasn't that I felt like I needed to attain a certain goal by a certain age or by a certain timeline. It was more, I needed to have a certain amount of structure in order to keep myself healthy and
Mm.
keep myself from kind of veering off in a completely different direction. Like, I needed some structure just to be like, hey, you need to do some self care. Hey, you need to clear this junk out of your life.
You needed to
And so
make that a part of your everyday.
yeah. And so I think some of that, like age timeline, that structure
Hmm.
could be certain cultural ways of saying, okay, you need to make this a
Hmm.
priority so that you can attain your goals. And I don't know, like, like, if, how strict they are on those structures, like if that
Hmm.
is part of their thing, like if that is a strict structure or if that's a hey, this is the structure we're going to teach you, and if you stick to this eventually you're going to get to the end goal.
Sure.
You see what I mean? Like there's
Yeah.
a difference between strict structure and structure to help you navigate.
Hmm.
And I mean, I'm a little bit loosey goosey structure girl, but I was not raised in a tradition that was like so structured with age requirements.
Hmm. That's an interesting way to look at it too, as potentially being just a guideline for paying attention to something.
Mm-hmm.
So, how would you feel then if, you were off your schedule and you didn't get the things, those self care items done for that day? Would it feel like it would throw you off?
You know, that's funny because lately I've been recognizing that I haven't done my self care stuff as diligently as I typically would.
Mm-hmm.
And I was sitting down meditating about this yesterday because I recognized I haven't smudged myself like fully. I've done a quick once over, but I haven't fully sat down and been 110% present. Not that I can be 110% present. That is,
You can be whatever
that's
you
too
want.
much. It's too much. There's 100%. But I haven't been as present with it as I maybe would have been in the past. And there was a moment yesterday where I got real judgy about it. And I'm like, oh, you haven't done your stuff. And like you teach other people that they need to do this to make sure that they're blah, 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 blah. And I was listening to all this chatter in my head and I went, no, 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 no. You haven't felt called to do this because you didn't feel like it was necessary in those moments. And now your attention is being drawn to this because you're feeling the need for it. And now you're listening. And so get out of there. Like it was like push these thoughts out of my head. Stop shooting all over yourself and just come back into that centered place and be a little bit more present with the next time that I smudge. Mm-hmm. And it was a recognition that okay, sometimes I need more structure and sometimes I don't. Sometimes I just need to listen to what my body is calling for. And yeah, there's probably times that I probably do need to do a more thorough clearing of myself or do more detox baths. But I'm not going to beat myself up about that anymore like I used to.
Good for you.
Because I'm doing what I believe I need in that moment. And there's something more to that. If I'm not doing it, there's probably something I need to learn about that. There's something I need to learn about my structure.
Gentle, loving way to approach that. Good for you.
You say that. It wasn't gentle and loving at first.
No,
it was more
like though, because you're learning how to like move some of the judgment you had on yourself away and just be gentle with yourself and what you need.
It was a process.
But I think these are important conversations too, because like I said earlier, sometimes people, when you are forthcoming with ways that you might have connection to the other side or other dimensions, people tend to sometimes think that you live this idealized version of life and that you don't also have exact same experiences as everybody else, you know, or that somehow this is like the one awakening and you're just like, that's it. But how freaking boring would eternity be if we got one shot at being like knowing everything and then that was it? We got like, you know what I mean? Like, come on. There's so many more experiences to have.
I feel like I would be the dumb one on the other side because I don't get things the first time usually. It takes me a little while. I'm a very tactile, very hands-on person. So you show me something once and I'm like, can you show me 10 more times, please? Can you draw me a picture? So I'd be the person on the other side going, I didn't quite make it through that lesson. Can we go over that again? Yeah.
I hope that people took from this conversation exactly what it is that resonated with them, but really the idea that there's a lot of different ways to do this. And there's a lot of really cool experiences that we get to have, even if we're craving that awakening, or whatever that looks like in your life. It's part of the whole cycle, and it can be lovely and challenging and amazing and whatever. But I personally don't believe you have to be 40. But if you're using that as a milestone for like, hey, at this point in my life, I'm gonna process things. I know one of the things we looked at too mentioned, you know, some type of connection to midlife crisis where you're starting to like recognize things in your life that you may or may not want in there anymore. Whatever it may be, using it as an opportunity for spiritual growth is always a good thing.
Yeah. No, when you brought that up earlier, I was like, oh, that makes so much sense. Because when you think your life is a complete shit show, which when you're in midlife crisis, usually you're like, well, I don't know what to do. And I'm going to go and buy this fancy car.
My dad got his ear pierced and then immediately had to take it out. Like, when he got home because my mom was like, no.
That's funny. Some people buy a fancy car, some people get a diamond earring. It's fine. But it's so true. Like we do these things to try to figure out who we are, what we want to experience. And then it's like all of a sudden you're like, well, I don't want that. oh, I don't want that. I don't want that either. And you get so much clarity. And I never thought about it. I never thought about how a lot of people when they go through midlife crisis, they come out of that on the other side with so much like, oh yeah, I don't ever want to do
Mm-hmm.
that again. I've been there,
Yeah.
done that.
Or like a
No.
reconnection to the things that they once really loved and
Yeah.
kind of rekindling of things. Like
Yeah.
it is a thought that that could be a piece of what people feel like are spiritual awakenings.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I think that every year your dad should just randomly pull out the earring and put it in. Just-
Well, it's been closed for years. Like, I'm pretty sure it never even got an opportunity to become any type of like permanent jewelry.
you should give him a clip on one day. Just
I should, just to
here you
freak out my
go.
mom. I love that idea. I'm gonna have
Oh
to do
gosh.
that next time I see them.
Your mom's gonna be like, you are not allowed to hang out with that girl ever again.
The best part about my mom, though, is even if she was like appalled at first, if she knew it was a joke, she would laugh her butt off too. You're such a stinker. She's just like that.
Well, they have the magnetic ones
They
that you can
do.
use for, so that would be perfect.
They do.
Tammy, I want to see pictures.
Oh, okay, I will. I promise I'll share it with you.
Yes. Cool.
Well, thanks for talking with me about that today. Thanks everyone for listening. And we will see you again in a week.
Bye, everybody.
If you want more woo, please feel free to check the links in the description. Of course, we love hearing from you, so keep letting us know all of your lovely ideas. Have a beautiful day, our wonderful woo mates.